featured dynamic rope today, as I said, is the 8.1 Verglas. It is an 8.1 millimeter rope. It's 5/16, and it comes in 60 meters or 70 meters standard, and we have a special discount going because of the webinar today. So for the next month through May 20th, you can get the 60 meter and 70 meter for 30% off. From our website. You can also contact our PMI customer service, and I will give all that information again at the end. The rope is USA made. It's certified UIAA 101 and EN 892. It features our ultra dry technology, and there on your screen you should be able to see some of the specifications for the half and twin for this rope. So today's presenter is Mick Follari. He is a PMI vertical specialist. So without further ado, I will give it over to Mick.
Okay, let's see. All right, thanks, Jessica. Yeah, my name is Mick. I am going to, there we go. My name is Mick, and as you obviously, I'm a climber, amongst other things. I'm also a photographer and a new dad, which is relevant because I'm here actually presenting from the coffee roasters in Moab, since we're out on our first family camping trip with my 17-month-old. So if you hear a little bit of background noise, that's what's going on, and hopefully that won't affect the presentation. I'm a big fan of double ropes, and in particular the PMI Verglas. And I want to run through kind of the reasons why I use them all the time for the things that I do. And so as a kind of a overview, I mean, I'll tell you a little bit about me, and then I'm going to go through a couple of sort of techie details, things that I have found or that I know about double ropes. And then I'm going to use the kind of latter half to talk about a huge whipper I took onto these ropes, ice climbing, and then a expedition that we made to Afghanistan, where these ropes played a big role in the things that we climbed. And hopefully out of all that you'll get a better picture of where double ropes are appropriate and kind of like what's so great about these particular ones. So, sorry, go back for a second. I have been climbing for quite a while and on a lot of expeditions. I like expeditions. I like going places far and near that are kind of out of the way. This is a picture of Juarez in Peru, where I've made 10 or 11 expeditions over the years. As you can see, it's kind of ideally situated to access. That's even just a part of the Cordillera Blanca range. And I said, you know, whenever you're choosing your equipment for whatever outing you're about to make, there are many factors that determine what you're going to need to use. And when it comes to ropes, I think that what you're going to do makes a big difference. Who you're with, how many people you're with, and the nature of the climb itself. And so it's often that having one single rope, you know, won't quite cover the basis for all the things you might do, and I'm going to get into where you use double ropes for that. So there's a quick overview of today. I already mentioned I studied as an engineer, so I like to know a bit about the physics, but then I'm going to anecdotally tell you about what I know in my gut about these ropes. First things first, you know, you got to have a rope. This is the situation where we didn't, and that's my buddy Pete, who also is a PMI vertical specialist, caught by a storm here in Colorado in the summer. We were delivering actually a PMI static rope for investigating a new route, a new free route up on the diamond, and kind of underestimated the descent. So given that you have actually brought your ropes, I'll say a thing about static ropes quick. Obviously, they're great for rigging, for shooting, climbs, doing photography, and to some extent maybe in aid climbing, but obviously you never lead on them. And I just wanted to highlight that PMI makes great static ropes too. Here's one in action, checking out a first ascent on the descent. So given that you're not using a static rope, and I don't want to belabor all this physics, but because many people do know it, but I'm hoping that a detail or two might pop out that you maybe weren't aware of before. So yeah, dynamic rope works like a spring. It absorbs the force of the fall throughout its length. And what I'm calling the useful length means the part that's basically the part that is useful between the belayer and you. That may not be that whole length for reasons I'll get in a minute. So it could be the amount of rope that's paid out, but there are things that can reduce that as well. And then, of course, the factor of the fall that we talk about, that's essentially a little arithmetical value that is the size of your fall over the amount of rope that's been put out. So as a couple of examples, or as an example, here's one hypothetical climber 60 feet up a route. He or she has a bolt 8 feet or so below his waist. And so, of course, oops, sorry about that. His fall will be 16 feet. Since there's 60 feet of rope out, that is on something like this here, where you're seeing this is a route called Grand Ole Opry, which is arguably the best 514 in the lower 48 of America. But it makes a difference that there's 60 feet of rope out. That, when it runs smoothly, is the amount of spring action you can get to absorb the forces on the rope. Another example would be something seemingly more innocuous. Climbers only 10 feet out from the belay, but let's say they haven't clipped any gear yet, and of course their fall is 20 right onto the belay. In this case, there's only 10 feet of rope out, so that's a factor 2 fall, which is normally kind of the worst case scenario. And I grabbed this little graphic online. You can see the link there. Apparently it's a Creative Commons, so I think I won't get in trouble. One note is that, as soon as you have a belayer an overzealous belayer perhaps, who starts pulling in slack as you fall, that could actually raise that to over a factor 2 and really load the belay and or belayer. The other complications are that your rope could be running not so smoothly through your gear or over the rock ledge or a roof. So any sharp angles that are made at the pieces, that's going to reduce actually the effectiveness of your rope. And so it could even to the point of turning what would otherwise be a nice soft catch into a really a high fall factor, including even being at the end. If it's at the end of the rope, you could end up with a factor 2 fall for that reason. This is all leading up to my discussion of double ropes, but here's an example. Somebody's 50 feet out from the belay, a number of pieces in. Let's say there's a piece 6 feet below her, but it's running at a sharp angle. If that angle's sharp enough and you're essentially almost pinching the rope at that point, you're going to end up with a 12-foot fall on just that last 6 feet of rope as far as the absorption of the force is concerned. This isn't really the greatest picture since he's sport climbing and those bolts are really pretty bomber, but I think it just makes the idea. So given that, you're choosing a dynamic rope and you're also trying to assess what it is you're about to go do, I sort of have my unscientific breakdown of the sort of sub-sports that are climbing. I kind of think of it like gymnastics. You may be really good at the rings or the parallel bars or the floor or whatever, and they all kind of fall under one envelope, but there are kind of different sports. And in this case, I think of these things as making up sort of different sports and requiring different equipment. And we all tend to do different things. Here I am bouldering, which is not really my thing in general, but this is but I do it. Obviously, bouldering is pretty lean on equipment. You don't need much more than a pad and your shoes and a chalk bag. and some spotters. Here's Abby, who is a real boulderer, and Paige Clausen there, my friend Pete, on an expedition we did to Peru, where we mixed up some real high-end bouldering at high altitude, while Pete and I try to do some alpine descents. Here's Jason Kale on another expedition we did in India, also the real deal. I will mention that even though it seems like bouldering pads are kind of a minimal amount of equipment, they are extremely hard to get overseas and costly. You try to ship them to places like India and Peru and deal with customs and whatnot. The horses don't mind them though. Course sport climbing is set up to be pretty safe. The bolts are usually bomber. It's hard to know who placed them always, but assuming that they were done in good rock and somebody who knew what they were doing, you don't usually have to think too much about reducing drag and that sort of thing. Here's the one of my favorite kind of go-to ropes for cragging, whether it be sport climbing or trad climbing, and that's the 9.4 Elite. It's really light and makes for smooth running through the gear. This is out in Clear Creek. Oops. Back to here. Trad climbing, of course, where you're placing your own gear, you got to think a little bit more about how to reduce that friction. Here you see a climber in El Dorado Canyon who's kind of properly runnered her pieces to make it so that the rope runs as straight as possible and reduce those sharp angles. So that's one technique that you have to employ, of course, trad climbing, is to properly runner the pieces. And then a note, of course, that with trad climbing you may or may not have great protection to work with. So you got to think about what the forces are going to be on those pieces to keep them in place if you were to take a fall. And then in the mountains, which is essentially trad climbing as well most of the time, you may not know what you're in for in terms of how you'll be able to follow the systems. Here's obviously a complex-looking system of cracks and things on Bhagirati. This is a trip in India back in the days of slide film, which you might be able to tell from the quality of the photo. There's my friend Jared there. We made an attempt on this, which is the far right buttress here. So from afar, you can't always tell what you're going to sort of get into. In this case, you could be meandering all over that buttress. So just to wrap up the trad climbing portion here, is Jordan Griffler and Pete making their first ascent of an old aid route called the Hypotenuse on the Diamond. They're using the 9.4 Elite. Great choice. It's light. It's a long way in there. You want to obviously not have to carry too much stuff or too heavy of a rope, and that does the job perfectly. Here, obviously you can see he's runnered things as well. Good rope management there at the belay, and making sure everything's running smoothly. And then ice climbing. Obviously a lot of times the nature of the climb is that it's not meandering, like in this case. Here's the Fang and Vale. Pretty straight. However, the ice itself isn't always of a quality to make for a really solid placement. So you do want to also reduce the forces on those screws as much as possible. Here, although I usually do use double ropes ice climbing, I've been checking out the new Erratic that PMI makes, which is kind of remarkably thin, light rope with a special technology where the sheath is bonded to the core. Although that's maybe kind of changing the game a bit. I think that actually is rated as a single, double, or twin rope. So that's something to check out as well. I really like the feel of it. It feels also to me remarkably soft and supple. It seems to flow through the gear really well. You can almost see the suppleness in that. There's Pete kind of flaking the rope, and you can see how it just kind of seems to flow. Of course, even domestic, sort of I call them domestic expeditions, you got to think about weight, how you're going to carry all your stuff in. This was a ski in to the Grand Teton. My buddy Nate, who I met in Peru years ago. You can see we've got the Erratic there also. In this case, actually, his rationale was a little bit inverted from my normal thinking on ropes. When I suggested we take the Verglas, he said, let's bring a single rope. Well, he knew I had this Erratic. He said, let's bring the single rope. It'll reduce our likelihood of retreating. Because normally I like having the double ropes as to make an escape, a quick escape easier. Once you get into the high mountains, it's even more and more important to manage all of those things, your rope handling, the forces on your pieces, which get even worse. You find really poor quality rock and poor quality ice up at altitude a lot of times, and the magnitude, of course, of the climb, the remoteness, makes the fall really dangerous. Here is, sorry, let me go back for a second. This actually is a face that Pete and I had tried twice. It's unclimbed, 6,300 meter peak in Peru. You can see it's crossing through bands of rock and ice and snow. Here's a close-up from our first attempt. You can see how Pete's using a half rope system, which is alternating pieces through two thin ropes. And this ice is terrible quality, actually. And very shortly after this picture was taken, from somewhere up here, he took a sizable fall, probably a 40-footer, and did get quite banged up. He may have cracked a rib, actually hit his elbow, and we had to retreat quickly. And there we were a team of two, so there was really not much help to be had. Luckily, we hadn't gotten too high on the wall. So, double ropes. It's a little bit of a not a misnomer, but it's perhaps poorly understood in some cases because it includes twin ropes or half ropes. Although now you have ropes like the Verglas, which are rated to work either way. And I, going through my photos for this presentation, found kind of a surprising number where people I've been climbing with were using them as twins, which is where you put both ropes through each piece. Here's Pete on another Peruvian expedition some years ago, before I had PMI ropes, actually. It included a bunch of difficult mixed climbing as well. And here's my same buddy Nate down here belaying, our other friend Sam on a Canada trip. He's using them as twins. Here you can see that he's got a screamer on, which is another way to try to reduce the forces on the piece. But you can only bring so many screamers, and they're actually kind of heavy, so I find myself often not having them on big mountains. Here's Sam again in Cody using the Verglas, the pink one and the pink and blue, as half ropes. So he's alternating his pieces. You can see there's some poor quality ice in here, and it's a way to mitigate both that variable terrain and also keep things running pretty smoothly through all the gear. Here I am on that Canada trip. This is by far the best thing we climbed that trip, called the Curtain Call, Water Ice 6. I'm kind of a fan of the half rope system, alternating my pieces. It takes a bit of practice. It takes a bit of consciousness about your ropes. If they cross kind of over or under as they go through, it can cause problems where you're actually adding drag instead of taking it away. But when you have that kind of into your muscle memory, it's I think the best way to go. Another important factor is if you're a team of three, which often works really well in the Alpine, multi-pitch ice climbs, or on big mountains. Because you have another person around, for help in case anybody gets hurt. There's 3 of you, and you obviously can split up the loads better and make carrying easier, and split up the leading duties if it's a really long, exhausting kind of route. Here's a day in Canada where we were climbing as a team of 3 on a multi-pitch ice route, and you can see that Nate and I here are both following at the same time. We give each other 20 feet or so, and you're able to quickly belay your followers using a system like any one of the auto block systems that's lightweight, and where you can individually belay your followers on each of the double strands. I just grabbed this actually off the PMI site. The graphic that we saw in the beginning was probably more succinct, but here you can see how the Verglas is rated. I pay attention to these numbers a little bit. I'm sort of interested in it, but this is the one that catches my eye, the impact force. Used as a half rope, you can see it's really low, 5.2 kilonewtons, which makes it load the piece as about as soft as you could get. Here's this Erratic, which is definitely throwing a kind of a wrench in the works for me in terms of my calculations. But again, I use it as a single really, although it is a very skinny rope that probably could work well as a half. I haven't tried it yet, and it's getting close to the Verglas. But as a single, it's got a higher impact force, which for a multi-pitch ice route or a multi-day high-altitude mountain, there's definitely still some advantages to having the Verglas. The other one I haven't mentioned yet, I'll kind of summarize them here. Obviously reducing drag and friction. By the way, I always thought it strange in the beginning when I started climbing here in the States that friends of mine who were British or who had spent time in Britain or Europe, especially Britain, were like sold on the double rope methodology and would use that even on what I considered normal cragging outside. But when you have to reduce drag and friction based on the meandering nature of the route or gear that's spread apart laterally, or that it's marginal and needs to be you need to reduce the force on that gear to try not to rip it out. When you take double ropes, you have 2 full-length ropes for your descents. I like bringing 70-meter Verglas on expeditions because that means we're just going to get off that thing faster, whether because we have to or because we've had a success. You do technically have 2 ropes which are rated pretty much for, I mean, when you fall on a half rope, you're essentially falling on one of them, and it will catch a fall, and it is rated to do so. So if one gets cut for some reason, you still could climb. They divide up nicely, of course, for carrying loads, and as I mentioned before, you can move efficiently with your team of 3, which is not a bad idea on those kinds of expeditionary climbs. So real quick, I'm going to go through a sort of dramatic experience I had involving a Verglas and why I trust it now with my life, as I did on that day. And then I'll get into that trip to Afghanistan. So here's the South Fork outside of Cody, where there's a bunch of great ice climbing to be had. It was my first trip up there. And I just want to mention that my friend Nate, who we've met here a couple times in these slides, who was with me on this day, who actually was belaying me on this fall, wrote a great blog post kind of dissecting what happened. And I actually stole or borrowed a couple of the photos from that in this next few images. So here's Nate accessing the routes, which we actually could have probably used a rope on as well. On this particular day, we were headed up to this pair of routes, which is called Moonrise and High Over Boulder. Moonrise on the right, High Over Boulder on the left. They are accessed by this same approach pitch, so it's kind of an efficient way to get a few pitches in. Here's Nate leading high over boulder. You can see he's using the Verglas there as a twin rope, running both ropes through each piece. I think that the ice was pretty good there. It was pretty plastic, and I don't think he was too worried about loading those screws too much. Here's my friend Scott and I followed that pitch, as you can see, again, simultaneously on each of the strands of the double ropes. And after that pitch, I was eyeing up Moonrise here, which is water ice 5 or 5 plus on that day. It was kind of wet. I was getting soaked and freezing kind of as the sun came and went a little bit. But the pitch went great. I felt great. And here you can kind of see the main pillar seen from the belay from below. It's worth mentioning, by the way, that this was my first trip climbing in a new pair of tools for me, which were the first generation Petzl Nomics. And that's important because here you can see the top of that pillar. This is probably the top quarter of that route. You finish the business there, and then the angle kicks back significantly to that slab of ice. Well, I have in the past been used to maybe more alpine-oriented tools which have the spike at the bottom of the pommel, and those Nomics don't have that. They're sort of meant for more difficult ice and mix climbing, and at least in that first generation, they just took away that spike down there. So I got to the top of this pillar, feeling great about having just dispatched this difficult wet ice pitch. When I got to here, I sort of scratched my head for a second because I didn't know what to do with the tools since I don't have that spike where I normally would hold the head and spike my way up that slab. And so I hung them on my shoulder. And I just sort of kicked my way up that slab. Well, unfortunately for me, I got somewhere just up and left out of this picture with my last screw being just a few feet below the edge of this lip here when I slipped and fell. And so I essentially luged down this slab and launched off the pillar. Here's Nate. Nate finished the pitch and shot a few of these photos from above, but here you can see Scott's following this. Nate's at the upper belay. This is about at the lip. This is about where I fell. I hadn't gotten this screw in. He did. So I was about here without a screw, and I slid on my butt, basically, sideways. Launched off that like a ski jump, and somehow miraculously came to rest about 80 feet from where I had started falling. This screw, which was the last piece of protection I'd placed, was the smallest of the screws, a 10-centimeter stubby, which held, and as you can see, there's a single strand of Verglas PMI rope running through that piece. Nate, who also is kind of an analytic mind, and you can read about that in his blog post, he investigated all that on the way up. He did see some radial cracks at the screw, but otherwise it held just fine. And I think we're all convinced that part of this being so uneventful in the end, because I was essentially unhurt. I had came to a rest here. I barely remember the flight part after launching off the edge there, and basically was unhurt. And I think we attribute that to the extremely low load force on this screw that didn't rip out, and it made for a very soft catch in this case. So there you can see how you can take really dramatic, sizable fall onto even a single strand. Okay, so I just want to run through the next few minutes this expedition. I'm going to run it more like a little bit of a slideshow and just talk my way through the trip itself and how the Verglas double ropes kind of played into our systems. So we we applied for and managed to get some help from the COP-Inspire Award to make this trip to Afghanistan. Johnny, Cop, and Micah were friends of mine, actually, and I just, and including my friend Dylan, who helped put this together. He and I and Johnny went on an expedition years ago to India. In fact, you saw the pictures of that Bhagirati. That was the trip. So this is actually in what in Greek they call the Oxus River, which divides what's now Tajikistan from Afghanistan. And briefly, I'll just mention that we did get stuck for quite a while in Tajikistan, unable to cross the border. There was a cholera outbreak, closed the border. It's obviously not an easy place to travel. Here's the local gas station in Tajikistan. See, it's not exactly a tourist place. This is after several weeks of phone calls and sitting around basically in a border town. We did make it across the bridge that's off behind me to get into Afghanistan, although once on the other side we got stuck for some time. They like their AK-47s there. These are the border guards at that bridge. We were stuck there for some 4 or 5 hours, but no lack of hospitality. Shared their lunch with us, and then we were able to move on. And so where we're headed from there is into the Wakhan Valley, which is like a panhandle or peninsula of land that's part of Afghanistan but sandwiched between Pakistan and Tajikistan. A relatively safe, it's sort of off everyone's radar. There isn't much, it's extremely poor. There isn't much there of interest to either the Taliban or us, so there's really been very little problem there. It's just hard to get in and out. As you move up the valley, you have the Hindu Kush to the south, which is that part of that peak. That peak there is part of the Hindu Kush. It's for the most part an agricultural valley. Of course, along the way, people are people. There's children are children. They're sort of wonderful everywhere you go. And we finally came to a small sort of outpost town. They grow a lot of wheat there, where we're going to launch our way into what is part of the Pamir Mountains on the north side of the valley. Here's a little boy with his pet box. And negotiating with, essentially, we took more or less the whole town's male population, over 20, I think, as our porters, which were 9 guys. And they managed to get us to a base camp up the Issyk Glacier, which is runs north-south from the Wakhan up into the Pamirs. And in the Pamirs you find, you know, many 5,000 and 6,000 meter peaks, almost 7,000 meter peaks with that have never been climbed. There's Dylan at our base camp, which we didn't stay at very long actually because it wasn't really that far up into the valley. Oh yeah, this is so barf, I believe, in Dari it means ice and snow, which is a clean thing, but to us it's obviously got a different cultural meaning. We had a heck of a time establishing an advanced camp because of the terrain that we had to cross to get there. It took many trips up and down this really horrendous talus. But we did establish this advanced camp. Stayed there for several weeks, only returning to the base camp we had set up once. But you can see it's a dramatic, beautiful spot. A bit of a tough camp there, but not too bad. And obviously we're a team of 3. We felt it would be a safer way to go on this trip for a number of reasons, both the travel and the climbing. On the left you have Aiden, who is a pilot, works a lot around Alaska and delivering planes around the world to difficult places in Africa and Central Asia. Dylan, who's a guide in Chamonix now, but came from Boulder, and me. So we didn't have too much of an agenda. We did have one real objective in mind, which we didn't even get to. I'll talk about that in a minute, but we set about exploring the valley and the glacier, looking for first ascents in a giant playground. Usual beautiful stuff that you see. Sunset. This is Koh Pamir, which is a almost 6,400 meter peak. This side of which has never been climbed, and our proposal in the grant was to climb this buttress, but when we approached it, these guys are not even close. This is actually very far to get in here. Due to the delays we'd experienced, we were into September at this point, and it was really getting cold, and we just didn't think we'd be able to rock climb in that kind of temperature. We did in our investigations find this peak in the upper right here, which is incorrectly marked on the map, and it is just over 6,000 meters and it had never been climbed, so we thought we'd do that as a warm-up. And here's kind of our approach. We figured we would try this little trick here. We figured that we would climb this way to the summit. Try that actually in red. Be ready to draw from now on. So yeah, we eyed this up from various angles, and you can't see it there, but that ramp goes all the way through. And we thought that would give us a healthy warm-up peak of a virgin 6,000 meter peak. We did encounter some mixed climbing. Here you can see the Verglas put into action. It takes a bit of rope management, of course. You're dealing with two ropes. You're clipping alternately, so I definitely recommend trying it out at the local crag before you're high on a peak with your friends. And then here your followers can climb simultaneously. You give each other 20 or 30 feet, and really efficiently get yourself to the next point. And then, of course, you can when you hit easier terrain, wrap up one rope and just pack it up. Here I'm packing up one of the Verglas because we're on some easier snow. Keep one handy if you can move ropeless for a while, which we did. Here's Aiden. It's pretty light. It's easy to carry. And then whip it out once in a while and move as a team of three simul climbing with a single double rope. Here we are getting towards the summit. Same system. I'm actually butterfly knot into the middle. Getting towards the summit here. Easily comes on and off, coiled up. Dylan, by the way, being a guide and a scientist, he could do an entire webinar on different ways he's developed for tying mountaineers' coils, but I won't get into it here. And here's the summit of this peak 6040, unnamed, unclimbed peak, looking south down the East Seat Glacier. I think our advanced camp is about here somewhere, and base camp is like about there. This is the Hindu Kush, and there's that valley we came from down below. Walk on. A couple moments for high fives, and then we headed back down. And heading back down, of course, now you have at your disposal two full 70-meter ropes, and you can cover as much ground on the rappels as possible. Here's kind of an overview of the peak. Here's our line of ascent. We did actually somehow manage to forget between the three of us, we forgot all three V threaders, and I just want to point out that it's worth developing the skill to thread ice V threaders with a stopper, because we had to do that about a dozen or 14 times to get down this thing. And then at base camp, you know, we try to make it as comfortable as possible. Here we're watching some movies on the iPad. Dylan and I actually, I think we had left a stuck rope up there at the very end. We actually had to reclimb the bottom pitch or two to reclaim our Verglas, one of them. And here you see basically the ropes that we brought on this trip. So we have the two Verglas half ropes. We did bring in a 9.4 Elite also because we didn't know exactly how much rock climbing versus ice and mountaineering would do. We wanted to have a few options. Okay, and here we get to see the ropes. Here's me goofily pointing at something. Well, what am I pointing at? This peak down here, let's go back to our camp here. So this peak has been sitting in front of us this whole time. And we just thought that there's some really dramatic big ice lines on here. So a nice close-up. So our next attempt was we wanted to climb this thing. And we did give that a couple of attempts. I'm just going to tell you from off the bat, we did not summit that peak. I don't believe it's ever been climbed, and certainly this route's never been climbed. That's another shot of it. Obviously things look really different every time of the day. I'm going to try and move along here quickly. That's our approach. Aiden and Dylan here on the bottom right. Of course, early morning, so you can see we're this time again we're bringing the Verglas, pair of Verglases as our rope choice. Approaching up that cone, and here's the beginning of what is couple thousand feet of ice and mixed terrain. I threw this in. Obviously, you can see we're racked up for all sorts of ice and rock. This also in the background is Koh Pamir, again, at 6,400 meter peak with a huge rock buttress that's never been climbed from that side. This is what we encountered, really difficult conditions. This ice, as you see, the darker ice is this extremely hard, ancient ice with no air in it, and then this really bad sort of shell on top, made for difficult climbing. Here's me making an attempt. Aiden also attempted it. We retreated once, regrouped, and came back again. Another time. Here again, we're a team of 3 with double ropes. Just find it to be the most efficient and safest way to go. Here's our Verglases racked up at the belay. And here we are again, team of 3, 2 followers. I'm at the bottom of this time. There's Dylan following quickly. This is probably our high point, if I remember. This is whatever the last pitch we got to, where I led. Aiden came up. We quickly stacked the one Verglas. That's what's on his shoulders there, and he's belaying up Dylan. It was a very wet pitch. The ropes got frozen into cables essentially, and we felt like we had no bivy gear on this attempt. We were sort of felt like we'd been bested that time, but gave it a good shot. There's another shot of Koh Pamir. You can see the kind of terrain that's around this valley. Hardly any climbing ever happened in there. And the heinous descent. This is just a small part of it. Ankle breaking and ankle and knee breaking. Our porters came to meet us. They were a day early actually, but kind of worked out. This is how they do lunch on the way down. And yes, this shirt does say, there's a fine line between salvation and drinking poison in the jungle, which is, I think, Aiden's Jim Jones shirt. 3,000-year-old petroglyphs that you find in Afghanistan, pretty interesting. There's another petroglyph overlooking the Wakhan. Beautiful people. And I'll just try to quickly mention that this is back at the border, a different border, which we had tried to cross once already before, back to Tajikistan, where Aiden, who's here in front, was actually unable to enter Tajikistan. His visa was incorrect, was incorrectly processed, and they said he wasn't able to come back in. And since he'd already been stamped out of Afghanistan, he actually was illegal in both places. And there wasn't much we could do, especially where we were. This gate, by the way, divides the two countries. That's the Afghan barracks over there. We're on the Tajik side. And the Tajiks, we had a little bit of a thing for us, this captain. He said no questions asked, and he sent Aiden back across this fence. And since he couldn't enter Afghanistan, he was going to be stuck in no man's land. We'll get to that slide out. So he went to set up camp here by the river. The Afghans saw his headlamp, came out with AK-47s drawn. He was able to defuse the situation. They actually took him in for a while to the barracks, not knowing what to do with him. And he spent a month illegally in Afghanistan trying to make his way to Kabul and to get home, which he did eventually. That's another whole story. So there you have it. I tried to keep it to 45 minutes. I'm going to end on this shot of our ropes, looking back down towards the Hindu Kush, the Isik Glacier, and hopefully that was informative.
Thanks, Mick. So if anybody has any questions, you can type them into the chat/question section of your control panel, and we will get to them. And it looks like we have one. So the question is, what is the difference, or the difference and the benefits or downsides of using half versus twin?
Well, let me see if I can. Let me try and do this. I think you're gonna see what I see if I do this, and I'll answer while I try to figure this part out. So when you climb with first of all, some ropes in the old days, ropes were either twins or halves, and twins were even thinner or rated lower. One thing to note though is that when you climb, these ropes will go either way, but when you climb with them as twins, the loads on the pieces are actually quite a bit higher. I don't know how to get out of this. Oh, there we go. Okay. Let me go back to this. Oops. Sorry about that. So if you look at the Verglas here, when used as a half, the impact force is 5.2, but used as a twin, it's 8.9. So using them as twins, it's much more like having a single rope. Now there's an advantage that many people find an advantage to using a twin over a single, because you do have two ropes there. You can see the numbers are pretty similar. These guys are all 7.9 here, getting up to 8.1 as thicker ropes. So used as twins, they're similar to that. They're going to load the pieces about the same, but you do have two ropes in case one gets cut or you need to rappel full rope lengths at the end of your day. I like the halves because, especially with marginal gear, the loads are so much less. So having the options are great because, as you can see, many of my friends that I climb with and I also have done it. The one thing to keep in mind, though, is that if you start up a pitch clipping as twins, you got to stick with it. I think you don't really want to switch in and out of a half twins system. Hopefully that answered the question.
Okay, thanks. And that is the only question that we have so far.
Okay.
So I am going to go ahead and start the closing up process. If you do have any further questions, you can feel free to type them in before we end and we can get to them. But I am going to switch the screen back to mine.
Okay.
Okay, so you should be able to see my screen now, and if you have further questions after this webinar, you can email Mick at the email shown on the screen, creativespark@follari.com. The PMI Dynamic webinar series hosts webinars frequently, so you can keep an eye on the PMI Dynamic website for future dates and topics. That's pmidynamic.com/webinar. A recording of the webinar, along with the slides, will be available within 24 hours at the link above. And remember, all 8.1 Verglas ropes are 30% off until May 20th. You can visit pmidynamic.com/products/81-Verglas or call 1-800-282-ROPE, and we can get you that 30% off until May 20th. For news and updates, which includes the future webinars on the PMI side, you can follow Mick and PMI on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, and all of those addresses are shown on your screen there. So we don't have any other questions, so I'm going to go ahead and close it up. So thank you very much, everybody, for watching, and we hope that it was informative. And thank you very much, Mick, for presenting this.
Yeah, thanks for having me. My pleasure.
Have a great. Sorry. Have a great day, everybody.